Welcome to the Peace Talk, this time with Stephen Youngblood. Stephen Youngblood is an associate professor of communication at the Park University. He organized and taught peace journalism in more than 25 countries around the world. He received 2 times a William Fulbright Scholarship, he published several books, and was in 2020 a Luxembourg Peace Prize laureate. Furthermore, he is the director of the Center for Global Peace Journalism, also at Park University. Dear Stephen, I'm very glad and honored that you followed my invitation for this Peace Talk.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So, as always, I'm starting with a biography, with a short journey to the past, and so it will be this time. I'm curious and I want to know what did motivate you to study, and did you have any academic role models?
Well, I will say, so I've always been involved in journalism. I first got involved in peace journalism in 2007 during my Fulbright in Azerbaijan. So I got a call from the US Embassy and they said, would you like to teach a peace journalism project in Georgia? And I'd always wanted to go to Georgia, next door to Azerbaijan, very beautiful, interesting place. And I said, sure, I'm an expert in peace journalism. As soon as I hung up the phone, I Googled peace journalism. So that's how I got started in peace journalism. And I've been working in the field ever since. I've had the opportunity to teach peace journalism in person in about 30 countries. So it's just been a tremendous experience and to get to know journalists and academics and students around the world, and to really work with these principles of peace journalism. As far as my academic role models, I guess that would start with Dr. Johan Galtung, who, as most of your listeners probably know, is the father of peace studies, the originator of the concept of positive peace. Well, he's also the father of peace journalism. And that shouldn't come as any surprise. Peace journalism and positive peace, certainly, there are a lot of parallels and interconnections. Another academic hero of mine is Dr. Jake Lynch at the University of Sydney, who's done extensive research into peace journalism, the efficacy of peace journalism. Both have been really generous and outstanding mentors to me.
Sounds nice, yes. And you're right, the audience might know Galtung from a previous interview. I was very lucky to do an interview with him, and he's a
Oh, that's wonderful. You were lucky to do that. I actually got to spend an entire afternoon a few years ago with Dr. Galtung, drinking tea and eating pizza and talking about peace journalism. I interviewed him for my peace journalism textbook and found him warm and gracious, and of course, from an intellectual standpoint, extremely fascinating.
Yeah, and even in this age, he's still sharp.
I think he's 92, maybe. But yeah, as I was discussing with these ideas with him, I noticed several times that he dumbed things down for me, which frankly doesn't happen very often. But when you're talking about a brilliant mind like Dr. Galtung, that's something he probably has to do all the time.
Yeah, he's fascinating. Yeah, and it's also very curious. My attention was drawn to your work and to you by coincidence, because of your social media account of Mastodon. It's a new social thing that is something like an alternative to Twitter. And yeah,
I'm not sure about that. I'm still exploring Mastodon. So ask me in a few months what I think of it. As I say, for me, the jury is still out. But anyway, yeah. It's nice that we were able to make that connection.
Yeah, and it's funny how people get interacted and people get connected and yeah, that stuff. Yeah, it's quite amazing. Yes. So let me begin with the first question related to your work. You mentioned already Galtung, and maybe let's dig deeper. What is peace journalism, and why do we need it now? Maybe in times of crisis, maybe now more than ever.
So by definition, peace journalism is when reporters and editors make choices that can create an atmosphere conducive to peace. And by the practice of peace journalism, according to Dr. Lynch, we're giving societies an opportunity to value nonviolent responses to conflict. So what choices are we talking about? We're talking about word choice, first of all. So the language that we use, does the language aid the reader's understanding of the story, or is the language merely inflammatory or sensational or racist? Another choice we make is framing. So how do we tell the story? Do we tell the story in such a way that it leaves the reader with the impression that only nonviolent responses are viable? Or do we give peacemakers, peace builders, a proportionate voice in the stories that we produce? What peace journalism is not. It's not open advocacy for peace. So we're not saying there must be peace, but we are leading societal discussions about peace. We are putting peace on the agenda. Peace journalism is not or does not sweep bad news under the rug. So we're not ignoring bad news. If a bomb goes off and people die, we have to report it. It's news. So the question for peace journalists is not, do we report it, but how do we report it? So it's these questions around framing, about language use, about giving a platform to peace builders, to the voiceless in our societies, about offering counter narratives. All of these are entailed into peace journalism. As far as your second question is concerned, why do we need peace journalism? Dr. Galtung first explored that in the 1960s and did a major study of journalism and found it wanting in the 1960s, found that it served mostly elites, found that it highlighted and glorified violence, found that in many areas, the coverage of news was deficient in the 1960s. Well, those deficiencies continue today. Deficiencies magnified and exacerbated by the modern world that we live in, by the media coverage of things like COVID, by political polarization, which here in the US seems to magnify and exacerbate every negative impulse that we have. And so I would tell you that I think peace journalism is not only needed when we're writing about conflict, but it's needed in lots of different areas of reporting, like environmental reporting, like criminal justice reporting, reporting about immigration and refugees, and so on and so forth.
So in other words, it has also to do with positive peace, with emancipatory peace. So it has to envision a society that is more, just more peaceful. Is it like this?
Well, I don't know if I'd put it exactly that way. I think that we look at the stories that we tell and we ask ourselves, what's the consequences of this reporting? So are we stoking partisan hatreds? Are we reinforcing racial and ethnic and religious stereotypes? So what's the consequences of our reporting? And how can we report in such a way that we can at least begin to mitigate these negative circumstances? Sometimes as a peace journalist, and I've made this comment in lots of places where there's conflict, Cameroon, for example. So in Cameroon, can the work of dedicated journalists there bring about peace? And the answer is no, certainly not by itself. So sometimes as peace journalists, the best that we can do is to not make a bad situation worse. And I think that that's the initial hurdle that we face as peace journalists.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So you said we should avoid, as peace journalists, we should avoid inflammatory speeches. We should show non-violent alternatives, even in times of war, which is difficult.
So it is difficult. So take the Ukraine war, for example. So we know that we have to report on that, and we know we have to report on the war crimes that the few possible war crimes by Ukraine, and hundreds or thousands of war crimes by Russia. So we know that we have to report on this. So how can we as reporters at least not deepen those hatreds? How can we as reporters keep a discussion of peace on the front burner? Because after all, and President Zelensky said this himself, at some point, this war is going to end at the negotiating table. So the only question is when that happens and how that happens. So that the discussion about that peace table and what can be done to facilitate peace needs to be an ongoing discussion in the media. And while we've seen some of that, in my opinion, we haven't seen enough of the coverage of what comes next, of the prospects for peace.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah, the weight is more on weapons delivery and this narrative, which leads me to the following question, because it has to do with framing, with ideology, and context. So showing the whole context is also, it has to do with power structures, because someone has an interest, or maybe there are interest groups or even states, which sponsored media or private corporate media, they have some interest. So we cannot separate the media and journalism from two things, from state and from capitalism. So what's your opinion on that?
Well, certainly there are obstacles to peace journalism everywhere. And what these obstacles are, and the severity or the intensity of the obstacles, that's not very well stated. The size of the obstacles varies from country to country. So in countries where the government tightly controls the media, offering context and balance can be a very difficult thing, maybe even an impossible thing. Yet, I've met with journalists for example, journalists from state-run media in Ethiopia, which is extremely tightly controlled. And when they wanted to meet with me, I thought, well, why? There's nothing that I can tell them. They have to just do what the state says. But I was surprised after the meeting that certainly some of the principles of peace journalism they can put into practice. So they're not going to be able to give equal voice to all those across the political spectrum. That's not going to happen. And they're not going to be able to give voice to critics of the government. But they can give voice to the voiceless in their society. They can reduce sensational and inflammatory language. So even in the confines of government control, there are some of these principles of peace journalism that can be enacted. In terms of commercial pressures, absolutely. So what we aspire to as peace journalists takes people, takes money. And we know all about the economic collapse of traditional media. So in lots of places, the US and in many EU countries as well, practicing any good journalism, let alone peace journalism, is quite a challenge. What Dr. Lynch has often written about, and I think is one potential solution to this, is the BBC model, that because advertising revenue can no longer adequately support most media, that a model similar to the BBC with government support, yet at least some insulation from politics, that might be a viable model for journalism and for peace journalism moving forward.
I totally can see your point. Yes. In my opinion, such a peace talk is important to show the whole spectrum, to don't fall in the trap of one-sided belief and thinking. So let's show the whole spectrum. For example, there are conspiracy theories which are saying that yes, some group is controlling the whole media and every journalist is corrupt and so on and so forth. This is one-sided and only tiny. Yeah, under the Trump administration, we saw many of such.
And these conspiracy theories are nonsense. To think that anyone who's ever worked as a journalist knows, even within one media outlet, it's impossible to corral and to direct and to control the journalists. This idea that there's some overlord dictating to the journalism profession what they're going to do is nonsensical.
Yeah. On the other spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum is this blind or naive belief that the media is showing the world like it is. It's also a bit short because the world as it is, we cannot grasp in one newspaper or in one coverage. So it is clear that there must be a framing, there must be a short version, something is was left behind, and something is shown. So this has to do with context, with ideology, with framing. So both sides of the spectrum are, so to speak, short or false in some ways. So
I mean, we use our journalistic judgment every day when we decide what stories to produce, how to produce them, who to interview, and so on. And so all that peace journalism asks is, as you consider these things and how you produce your stories, keep in mind as well that there are consequences to how we tell stories, particularly conflict stories, and ask journalists to be more thoughtful in how we frame these stories.
Yeah. I'm curious if you had any contact with this so-called embedded journalists. So journalists who go in a war area or in a country where war is going on, if it's a civil war or whatever. What is your opinion on this? Because it's difficult to, the soldiers are protecting these journalists on one hand. So they are not totally independent of them. So it's a quite interesting phenomenon that we see nowadays with this so-called embedded journalism. Also, there is sensationalist perspective of this heroic soldier, and then these moments of heroic battles and so on and so forth. So I will be quite honest, I have my problems with this kind of embedded journalism that, journalists go to war and report.
So just in case your audience members aren't familiar with this concept, an embedded journalist is a journalist who literally becomes a non-shooting member of a military unit. He goes where they go, he or she eats what they eat, sleeps where they sleep, does everything but the shooting, and then produces reports about that. I share your concerns. My thought is that if you're going to use an embedded journalist, that every single story needs to have a sidebar that explains this journalist is embedded, this journalist is a member of this unit, that this story does not pretend to be objective because this journalist is under the protection of these soldiers. This journalist has probably made friends with these soldiers. So this is not an objective report. And so if somehow that sidebar can appear with every single story, with every single embedded journalist, I'm good with it. Otherwise, I think it can be misleading.
Yeah. And now you mentioned a very beautiful concept of think, and that is always a thing that I said, and I spoke about it many times. What I would like to see in not only politicians but also journalists, to wear such a badge, such badges where it's shown, okay, I'm sponsored by ExxonMobil, or politicians who are sponsored by the military industrial complex. So such badges would it makes my life easier to vote, or it makes my life easier to, okay, this journalist is sponsored by this and this corporation, so I can see where he is coming from, so I can judge better the words that he's saying, and the framing and the context and everything. So this, I believe it is valid for democracy, but also for journalism. So this kind of transparency.
There's actually an American media outlet that does that, National Public Radio, NPR. Let's say they're doing a story about Microsoft. They'll say during the story, they'll say Microsoft is one of the sponsors of NPR, and then they'll go on to tell their story. So I agree with you, as much transparency as possible. Transparency for journalism especially, I think, is vitally important. So when we see trust in media continuing to decline, I think one of the things that we can do to combat that is to be as open and transparent as possible about where we receive our funding, and indeed about our processes, like I mentioned a minute ago with the embedded troops.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. In a fantastic interview that you did in Kosovo, you said that journalists shouldn't be looking on clicks and hits and reads and consider their language and so on and so forth. So now we are getting into this phenomenon of clickbaiting, for example, that online journalists are looking for these clicks. They are hungry for clicks. And this clickbaiting, it depends how famous they get. And these are economic incentives that are leading journalists to be more polarizing, so it's difficult to judge the journalists, in my opinion. I mean, they have a rent to pay, maybe they have kids to feed, and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure how I can judge this situation, but I believe we need to change the structure. So journalists should be paid well. Maybe there should be public fundings for good journalism. And what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I understand the impulse to make yourself into a brand, right? And you do this by having, hundreds of thousands or millions of social media followers and so on. The question I would ask those journalists is, what price do you pay for making yourself a brand? And I think that good journalism and peace journalism can still be practiced and can still lead to the kind of response, can lead to what I would call responsible branding, but that's the high road. And we know that there's a low road too, a low road of pandering and sensationalism and so on that can get you the same followers and the same brand. So how do we incentivize the high road and disincentivize the low road? And I think it's a key question in our profession.
Yeah. What is interesting for our viewers that are not so into academia, maybe we can give some examples. For example, two examples that are coming up in my mind are, for example, the easiest one is terrorist, for example. Who is a terrorist? So if you ask Assad, the Kurds are terrorists. If you ask the Kurds, Assad is a terrorist. So so it's a quite a funny thing. And also with migration, I watched your lectures, and it's a quite often seen phenomenon that migrants are framed as dangerous and so on and so forth. So maybe we can show the audience some examples of what we are saying.
I mean, so worldwide, we see the same sorts of frames and language and themes emerge when we're talking about immigrants or migrants of all kinds, immigrants, IDPs, refugees, and so on. I've had the opportunity to do some peace journalism and immigration projects in Turkey, in Lebanon, and in Germany and Austria. And what researchers in all these places have found, and in the United States as well, what researchers in all of these places have found is that, generally speaking, these migrants are framed negatively. They're often tied to crime, they're often tied to drugs, they're often tied to disease, and so on. So in Turkey, if a Syrian refugee kills someone, the headline is Syrian refugee commits murder. If a Turk murders someone, it just says murder committed, right? So the only time that the nationality is mentioned if it's a Syrian. And so the peace journalism projects that I've worked on in all of these places talk about how to present migrants in a more 360-degree way that doesn't just present them as a burden, as a flood, as a danger, but talks about the other aspects of their migration. Positive, in the case of the United States, the many positive economic benefits that immigration brings to our country. Yet the media tend to focus only on the negative. Now, I'm not suggesting that we ignore the negative, but to get a complete picture, we need to also talk about things like their economic impact, talk about things like their cultural, positive cultural influences and things like that. So that's what peace journalism does, is it looks at the way that we report immigrants and it thinks, can we do a better job? It looks at the divisive way that migrants are covered in lots of places, and it asks instead, can we use journalism as a way to build bridges between these, between host communities and migrant communities? And that's what my projects have done in, as I say, in Turkey, Germany, Austria, US, and elsewhere.
Yeah, very interesting, and this is a crucial work, I believe. Also, this leads me to this idea that we have to show the structural, let me put it in Galtung's word, the structural violence. So we have to show the structure behind it that lies behind this migration and movement and so on and so forth. So why do people leave their home? It's not a funny thing. They leave their friends, maybe their parents, their culture, their tradition, and the food, even the food. I'm missing, for example, my Austrian food when I go abroad. So it's not funny for most people, I believe. So why do people leave their country? So we have to show that there is war, there is economic injustice, there are, prejudices, racism, and so on and so forth. So we have to show the whole picture, and that's a very beautiful mission of peace journalism to show the whole context.
Absolutely, and this is why we talk so much about the voice of the voiceless, right? So we hear a lot from critics of migration, critics of refugee resettlement, but don't hear enough, I think, about, as you say, the desperation that leads one to abandon a home country, often with nothing but the clothes on their back, a few dollars, a suitcase, and that's it, and starting a new life. I mean, imagine the forces that must be at work to cause someone to do this.
Yeah, this is crucial. Yeah. In the same interview that you did in Kosovo, I was listening carefully, and at one moment I think I would disagree with you, but maybe it's a misunderstanding on my side, and maybe it's just a term, because you said that peace journalists should be neutral. With this term neutral, I have my problems, because nobody is neutral and objective in my opinion. Everybody has some interests. They are paid by someone, or maybe they have some personal interests, cultural interests. Maybe they are related socially to a group or ethnicity or religion or whatever it is.
So I should have just added these two words: neutral as possible.
Yeah.
So objectivity and neutrality are an aspiration, a goal. Journalists can never be truly objective, or journalism organizations can never be truly objective. I think that we should strive to be as objective as we can be, while at the same time being honest about our biases, being transparent about our funding and our influences, and so on, but as much as possible.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and yeah, now I totally agree. So please give our audience and me an insight of your long years of work abroad. So you lived and taught in Georgia, for example, and in many other countries in the Middle East and so on. So could you describe your work there? What was your most beautiful moment or inspiring moments, or maybe what did you learn encountering so many different cultures, languages, people, and of course conflicted areas, and give us some insight.
Do you have 12 hours? This is a question akin to, what's your favorite movie, or which flower smells the most beautiful? It's impossible to say in any sort of succinct fashion. In terms of my longer term projects, you mentioned my two Fulbrights. So I had a Fulbright in Moldova and a second Fulbright in Azerbaijan. I did a year-long project in Uganda that was about peace and electoral journalism. I've also been to Kenya and Cameroon many times. My work in Cameroon was during the recent Anglophone crisis. I've done a lot of work in post-conflict societies, places like, and I hesitate to say post-conflict, post-violent conflict anyway. So you mentioned Kosovo. I was there recently. I did a long project in Northern Ireland. And in fact, right now I'm pitching a new project that would bring together journalists from Kosovo and Northern Ireland in a project that would talk about how to responsibly report about the past and about memorialization efforts of the past. I recently finished a 2-year, 3-year project with the East-West Center from Honolulu. And this project brought together Indian and Pakistani journalists to jointly report on issues of importance, non-conflict sorts of issues, things like environment and economy and health and so on and so forth. So that's been a very rich experience. Any experience that I've had that seeks to build bridges, including that very first one in the Republic of Georgia. I think these are the essence of peace journalism, and this is where we can see its impact. In terms of moments that I've had, there are just too many to mention. Needless to say, every time I go someplace, I end up learning more than my students learn, which is probably a good thing a wonderful thing for any teacher.
Yeah. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for your insights. Let's jump to a very interesting question and maybe a theoretical question. Was Ghandi the first peace journalist?
Well, this was an article that that was written in the Peace Journalist magazine. So if any of your listeners are interested, my center publishes a magazine twice a year called The Peace Journalist. So if you just Google that, you can easily find all the back issues of the magazine, including the one that asked the question, was Ghandi the first peace journalist? Now, according to the author, the answer was, if he wasn't the first peace journalist, he was certainly an important peace journalist, talking about at length about the influence of media, both positive and negative, on peace and peace processes, and as a tool to empower those without power. Interestingly, about 3 years ago, my university, Park University, welcomed Professor Raj Gandhi, the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, to our university to give some lectures. And we talked about that as well with Dr. Raj Gandhi, who indicated, again, in his view, that his grandfather certainly did begin a lot of discussions about the role of media in peace and in conflict.
Very interesting, yes. What I was wondering about Ghandi is his strength, his belief. He continuously believed in what he has done, and yeah, it's quite amazing because so many people drift to hate and okay, we see the oppression, we see the imperialist system, and to not hate them is very difficult. And me, for example, as an anarchist, I see it in my bubble, in my leftist bubble, that people get angry and they hate not only fascists, but everybody's a fascist. And in the anarchist bubble, everybody's a fascist. Even if you are conservative, oh my God, you're a fascist. So this leads me to the belief that we have to be more peaceful. So the Ghandi inspires me in this sense, because hate is, I believe, the most easiest way, but peace and forgiveness
and what Gandhi and many of his successors have said is that when individuals hate, that the victim of this hate isn't the person to whom it's directed, but the victim of the hate is you yourself when you hate. That hate has a corrosive impact on us. And I think that we recognize that that's true. To forgive is not a gift we give those who have transgressed against us. To forgive is a gift that we give to ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, we will put the link of the journal in the YouTube info box, of course, so
Thank
people can read the papers and if they are curious. And yeah, of course. So let's move on to the next question, which is directed to the Center for Global Peace Journalism. So you worked there, you're a director of the Center for Global Peace Journalism. So let me begin. When did it all happen? When did it start? What is the mission? What are the goals? What is the vision? And yeah, maybe we can outlet some missions or projects that are upcoming, and so people can follow them or people can join it. Maybe you are also looking for academics or journalists, whatever, and people can reach out for this.
Right. So I began my peace journalism work in 2007. And then a few years later, we collectively decided that the best way to leverage this work would be to establish the Center for Global Peace Journalism at Park University. So what we do is we work with journalists and academics and students worldwide, of course, to improve reporting about conflicts and many other things like social unrest and reconciliation and solutions and some of the things we've talked about, immigrations and so on. So the center operates through workshops, short courses, lectures. The magazine is very important. I write something called the Peace Journalism Insights blog that you can also put in the link. And we offer other resources as well. So that's essentially what the center does. Now, in terms of ongoing activities, right now we have a number of irons in the fire. I mentioned the Kosovo, Northern Ireland project that we're talking about. I'm discussing projects with colleagues in Kenya. I'm going to be pitching some further projects, perhaps in the Baltic region, so stand by on that. In addition, I'm looking at a possible project, a long-term project in Moldova to talk about peace journalism and countering Russian misinformation.
Okay, sounds great. Yeah, I will follow it for sure. Yeah, this was my final question. Yeah, if you would like to add something, did we miss something?
I appreciate the time to visit with you. Again, if people would like to learn more, they can begin by looking at the Center for Global Peace Journalism website, which is very easily found at park.edu/Peace Center. And Peace Center is all one word. And that's it. And that's your key to resources, to the magazine, and so on.
Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.